No one in Fairmont Crest could remember the last time silence felt harmless, but tonight the quiet carried a different weight, cold, dense, and suffocating, as if an invisible hand were tightening around every room. The lights inside the expensive houses still glowed, cars still slipped past the security gate like nothing had changed. Yet a fracture had opened beneath the polished surface, and something dark was creeping through the corridors, into the walls, into the phones that vibrated till late at night. Sometimes a family isn't shattered by a gunshot or a public scandal, but by a short call, by a pause that lasts a second too long on the other end of the line, by a sentence that cannot be softened no matter how gently it is spoken. And when Anita's name appeared, anyone who still believed power could outmuscle death was about to learn how fragile that belief really was. The most terrifying part wasn't simply that a formidable woman was in critical condition. It was the way her collapse could become a key one that unlocked truths that had been bolted down for years, truths that, once released, would not only threaten a life, but destroy trust, dismantle the family, and burn the vows they once defended in the name of honor. In the stark white hospital room, Anita lay motionless, as if her body had become a monument and someone had quietly stolen the soul that once animated it. She was still there, but the presence that used to command silence with a glance, that could bend a room without raising her voice, had been replaced by the cold rhythm of machines. Her crisis was no longer a possibility. It was a reality advancing in measured increments. Every heartbeat, every number, every dip in a line on a screen. Her doctor had fought it with training and with a stubborn belief that women like Anita did not simply fall, but charts did not care about legends. Standing behind the glass, watching the metrics slide downward like steps disappearing beneath a person's feet, the doctor understood that, if he waited any longer, he would not only lose a patient, he would witness a family crumble without warning. The call to Vernon came with a cruelty that felt almost personal. It arrived just after he had finished dealing with the things that were always important to him: assets, leverage, alliances, the architecture of influence, as if life were mocking him by placing the ordinary beside the absolute. The phone vibrated. The doctor's name appeared. Vernon felt dread ignite in his chest before he even answered. He was not a man prone to panic. He had absorbed bad news about markets, enemies, lawsuits, and media attacks. But bad news about Anita was the one thing he had never truly trained himself to face, because somewhere deep inside him lived an arrogant certainty that she was immutable, the pillar that kept every loose fragment of this family from splintering apart. When the doctor spoke of severe deterioration, of numbers falling into dangerous territory, of the possibility that there was not much time, Vernon didn't just hear words, he heard something crack. The sound split the air inside his mind, like thick glass breaking glass that had always seemed unbreakable, so he had never prepared himself to gather the shards. His shock did not explode outward in theatrics, it imploded. It sealed him into a private room of helplessness, one where power had no currency. His throat turned dry, his grip stiffened around the phone, and part of him shifted instantly into control mode, firing sharp questions as if he were negotiating with an opponent. But the doctor was not the enemy. Death was, and death did not negotiate. Vernon hated that more than anything, hated being forced to listen, hated being forced to accept, hated the realization that he could not order fate to step back. He hated it even more when he understood what he was truly facing. If Anita slipped away, he would not only lose his wife, he would lose the only person who could look him in the eye and tell him the truth without flinching and still be heard. He would lose the one mirror that reflected even his darkest angles. Most frightening of all, he would lose the final moral anchor in this house. But the deeper shock came afterward, when the call ended and Vernon stood alone in his shadowed office. Fear did not only wear the face of death, it wore the face of consequences. A man like Vernon knew the brutal mechanics of power. A pillar falls, and the space it leaves behind becomes a battlefield. Anita's crisis would create a vacuum, and that vacuum would be filled with ambition, resentment, and plans that had been smothered for years. He pictured the faces of his children, Nicole with her controlled composure and hidden fragility, Donnie with her wildfire anger and choices fueled by emotion, and the rest of the relatives Anita had held in a fragile order. Anita had been the only force strong enough to make them stop tearing at one another. Without her, they would do it not merely with words, but with actions. And Vernon, though he would never admit it aloud, understood he was part of the reason. He had allowed too many secrets to accumulate inside this family. Secrets Anita knew. Secrets she may have carried in silence to protect the whole, or because she too had shadows she never revealed. Now, with her hovering near the edge, that silence had become a bomb with a ticking fuse. Vernon called Nicole first. He expected himself to remain composed, to deliver the information like a briefing and move straight to action. But the moment he heard her voice, something inside him trembled like a bridge under strain. Nicole did not collapse into instant sobs. What frightened Vernon about Nicole was the way she often reacted by freezing. She tried to understand, to file information into order like a problem that could be solved, because, if she remained rational enough, perhaps her mother would not die. Yet that very rationality was proof of panic. It revealed how tightly she was strangling her own emotions just to stay intact. Nicole asked about Anita's condition, about recovery chances, about whether there was anything else, as if she was searching for a crack in the wall she could slip through. When Vernon admitted how grave the doctor's words had been, Nicole fell silent for a second too long. In that silence, Vernon realized his daughter had just been robbed of the one anchor she had always assumed would hold. At the same time, a violent inner conflict began to split Nicole in two. She wanted to run to her mother immediately, but she was also afraid. Afraid of seeing her mother weakened, afraid of learning the wall was not a wall at all, afraid of the helplessness she had always dodged by burying herself in responsibility and becoming the strong one. With Donnie, the news didn't arrive like a knife. It arrived like an explosion. Donnie was made of emotion and reflex, and her first reflex was not grief, it was rage. Rage at an unfair world. Rage that her mother, the woman who carried the sky for all of them, now lay there like a victim. Rage because, in that instant, Donnie realized how much time she had wasted fighting, arguing, proving herself, demanding recognition, shaping her life around pride instead of love. That rage quickly turned poisonous. Guilt compressed so long it needed violence, if not physical, then emotional, to escape. Donnie began to blame herself, then lash outward and blame everyone else. Memories flashed through her mind like a film rewinding at high speed. Anita stepping in, Anita extinguishing scandals, Anita looking at Donnie with disappointment, yet still opening her arms. Donnie feared that if her mother died, all the ugliness inside her would lose its only restraint. She feared even more the thought that her own chaos had helped wear her mother down, that Anita had carried too much for too long, and her body was collapsing under that invisible load. That thought drove Donnie toward madness, and when Donnie tipped into madness, she didn't simply break, she tried to break everything around her, so she wouldn't have to face the truth inside herself. Vernon responded the way he always had, by turning pain into a plan. He organized the situation like a campaign. He made calls, demanded secrecy, already imagined controlling the narrative if anything leaked. But each decision carried two sides: protection and concealment. Some relatives responded with genuine panic, but others responded with something colder, harder to name: calculation. In powerful families, the decline of a matriarch is never just personal. It is political. Anita was not only a mother, she was a symbol, a keeper of financial threads, social networks, and unspoken promises between families. If she was dying, those promises could be rewritten. Eyes began to shift, and not all of them were wet with grief. Some looked at Vernon as if he were no longer the man beside Anita, but the man standing in front of a vacant throne. Betrayal began to form in the way each person chose to react. Nicole tried to remain calm, but the harder she tried, the more she felt she was betraying her mother by refusing to fall apart. She moved through the hospital like a disciplined soldier, while her mind screamed that she was running from love by hiding behind strength. Donnie went the opposite direction. She let emotion consume her, and inside that hurricane, she began to make harder, sharper decisions. She wanted a cause, she wanted a culprit. She could not accept an invisible illness or a natural twist of fate. Donnie needed someone to blame, and when a person needs someone to blame, logic becomes flexible, shaped to fit pain. Donnie began to suspect there was more. Something done to Anita, something slipped into her system, an intervention, a hidden medical truth. Suspicion like that might begin as love, but it can metastasize into paranoia, and paranoia always pulls destruction behind it like a shadow. When Vernon arrived at the hospital with Nicole and Donnie, the truth struck them with the smell of antiseptic and the harsh glare of fluorescent light. Nicole saw her mother behind the glass, and what she felt first wasn't even sorrow, it was the collapse of order. For one unbearable second, Nicole was a child again, standing before a closed door, terrified of what would be on the other side. She wanted to hold her mother's hand, but she was afraid that hand would be cold, afraid of the certainty that her mother was slipping away, and she could not keep her there. The loss had not happened yet, but it had taken shape, and that was the cruelty. Pain stretched endlessly before the ending arrived. Donnie could not tolerate the helplessness of the whole way. She paced like a caged animal, nails digging into skin, eyes raw and burning, her rage searching for a target. Vernon became the nearest one. Donnie looked at her father and saw the man who always prioritized image, status, control. In Donnie's mind, if someone had pushed Anita to carry too much, if someone had drained her life down to this, it was Vernon. She didn't have to say it. Her stare accused him more violently than words could. Vernon felt it, and anger rose in him too. He resented being judged in this moment, resented the fact that he was also in pain, and no one allowed him to show it the way he knew how. But beneath that resentment, something sharper lived, the fear that Donnie might be right. Vernon remembered sleepless nights, Anita's quiet warnings, Anita telling him to loosen the pressure on the family, Anita urging honesty. He had promised, he had broken those promises. He had promised again. Now promises felt like ashes, and those ashes stung his eyes until breathing became difficult. In the middle of the emotional wreckage, another shock approached, quiet, clinical, but just as lethal. The doctor mentioned that Anita's decline carried irregularities that could not be explained entirely by underlying conditions. There were indicators, small, uncertain, but impossible to ignore, suggesting drug interaction, a trace of something that did not belong. It wasn't enough to accuse anyone, but it was enough to ignite suspicion. And in a family like this, suspicion was gasoline. Donnie clung to it immediately, like a drowning person grabbing the one branch that could keep her afloat, because it gave her what she needed to survive, direction for her rage. Nicole, meanwhile, slipped into a different kind of crisis. If there was even a possibility someone had influenced Anita's condition, then the threat was not only death, it was betrayal from inside the home. That thought made Nicole physically sick, because it turned grief into disgust. Vernon's instincts sharpened. He wanted to control the information, control what went into the file, control who said what and when. Part of it was protection. He refused to let anyone stain Anita's final days with cheap rumor. But part of it was something else, fear. If an investigation began, other secrets could rise with it, secrets Anita had carried for him, decisions they had made behind closed doors in the name of the greater good, favors Vernon had demanded, silences he had bought, lines he had crossed. He did not want those ghosts climbing out of the dark at the exact moment Anita was fighting to breathe, because once they surfaced, Anita would not be remembered as a mother in a hospital bed. She would become a name inside another scandal, and Vernon could not bear that, even if he had helped build the lie that made it possible. Nicole stood between two fires, her love for her mother, and the shifting shape of truth about her father and her family. She realized she had lived inside a story that had been carefully edited. Anita may have been the editor, cutting out the uglier scenes so her children could still believe in family. If Anita was leaving, the editor was disappearing, and the uncut version would spill out like blood. Nicole felt anger rise, anger at being protected into innocence. Anger at not knowing what Anita had endured. Anger that the stability Nicole prized might have been built on Anita's sacrifice. Yet that anger immediately turned into guilt. How could she be angry when her mother was dying? The contradiction became a prison. Every emotion felt like betrayal. Donnie chose destruction as a form of survival. She pressured the medical team to recheck everything, demanded records, demanded to know every person who had touched Anita's care, every moment, every prescription. She did not care who she offended, because grief without an answer felt like insanity. In the process, Donnie risked exposing what the family had worked to keep buried, appointments that never should have happened, medications that raised questions, a visitor no one had spoken about. Donnie was being driven into a corner by the idea that, if she could not find a culprit, she would have to accept that life could steal her mother without meaning. Donnie could not live in a meaningless universe, so she would manufacture meaning at any cost, even if it meant tearing the household apart. Vernon faced the hardest choice of his life, whether to tell his children everything he and Anita had hidden, so they could be prepared, or to keep protecting the family's image until the last possible moment, even if the price would be far worse betrayal later, when the truth detonated on its own. He understood the cruelty of both options. If he confessed, his children might hate him now. If he stayed silent, they might hate him later, and perhaps even hate Anita for her complicity. For the first time, Vernon felt weak, not because he was powerless, but because every available decision tasted like blood. And so the loss spread beyond the possibility of Anita's death. The loss was the family itself, the idea of it, the thing they had pretended was solid. They might still share a name, a house, a fortune, but trust could snap, and once snapped, no amount of influence could restore it to what it had been. Nicole stared at her mother and realized something unbearable. Anita might have loved them enough to become the villain in silence, to swallow secrets and endure wounds so her children could sleep. Donnie stared at her mother and realized something else. Anita may have loved them so fiercely she forgot to love herself, and her body was now paying the debt for those years. Vernon stared at Anita and understood the final truth. If she died, he would be left with everything he had prioritized, and it would become meaningless, almost disgusting, without her beside him. Then the night deepened, and the doctor stepped out again with a heavier face than before. There had been another drop, not a recovery, a slide. They needed to prepare for the worst. That was the moment all three, Vernon, Nicole, Donnie, were pushed against the wall of their own emotions. Vernon felt a roar in his chest, like a wounded animal, a desperate urge to smash the world into obedience, just to buy Anita one more hour. Nicole felt the last wall of control begin to fracture, and inside that fracture, she realized she could not keep playing the strong one forever. Donnie felt her rage transform into a new kind of despair, one that could make her do things she could never undo. And just as they stood there on the edge of breaking, a nurse delivered a small, unsettling detail, one more fragment from the hours before Anita collapsed, one more note about a contact that no one had considered important. It still wasn't proof, not yet, but it was enough to open a horrifying question. Was Anita only losing a battle against the body, or was she being dragged down by a hand moving in the shadows of her own family? The moment that question surfaced, it threatened to turn everyone left behind into enemies. Vernon's fist tightened until his knuckles whitened. Nicole felt her heart drop into emptiness. Donnie's lips twisted into a tearful, broken smile, as if she had finally found a door through which she could pour her blame. But once that door opened, it might unleash a storm one could close again, one that would not only challenge death, but something far crueler, the war between love and truth, where any of them could become the traitor simply because they were too afraid to love each other without lies.